Ecclesiastes chapter 1. We got as far as about verse 12 last Wednesday night. We've been discussing how that Solomon, who by all contextual clues as well as external historical clues, there's no reason to think Solomon's not the author. He's writing this from the perspective of Solomon, the old wise man, looking back on his life. Not as, even though he's still currently king, he's not writing this as a royal decree. He's writing this from the perspective of, here's what I experienced. And especially from the perspective starting in verse 12, when he says, I, the preacher, was king over Israel and Jerusalem. He's not using that in the past tense to say he is no longer. He's saying that to cover the scope or the spectrum of wisdom he'd accumulated due to his having left the service of the Lord to experience all the pleasures of life. That's what when he says verse 12, he's kind of defining the scope of how he's gained this knowledge. And the reason he gained it was because of his mistakes. These are the mistakes that he made and what he learned from it. And he's hoping to spare everyone who reads this the same issues, the same problems. So when he says, I was king over Israel and Jerusalem, and I set my heart, this is all one thought. He says, I set my heart to seek and search out by wisdom. He's going back to the beginning. This is kind of when he started this figuring out things in this journey that took him through this spectrum of wisdom that he's going to write. So I set my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all that is done under heaven. There are those who go to verse 13 and say, see, it can't be Solomon, because Solomon was already given wisdom by God. And he says he set his heart to seek and search out wisdom. Is that what he says? Search out by wisdom, which means he already had wisdom. So what is he searching? He's searching to understand life. He's searching to understand the experiences of life, the observations of life, and to that end, as he's going to note here in a little while, that he enjoyed all of the pleasures under the sun, even beyond what God would approve. So when he says in verse 13, I set my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all that is done under heaven, this burdensome task God has given to the sons of man, by which they may be exercised. What burdensome task? What burdensome task has God given that exercises us? Sorry? Okay, sure, yeah, being faithful to God. Certainly there's an exercising of our knowledge and wisdom regarding God's word.
All the things that are done on earth, he's seeking out himself by wisdom to figure it all out, see it all.
To be able to understand and grasp the meaning of things, okay? And to a certain extent, in a way, every person at some point in their life has a period where they're kind of just trying to find themselves. Most times it happens when we're in our teenage to 20s, somewhere around there. We're just trying to figure out our place and figure out who we are, what we want out of life. And Solomon is using this to observe what is life all about? Ecclesiastes is the answer to the age-old question, what is the meaning of life? Ironically, the answer is quite simple, as he gets to in chapter 12 and in verse 13. But this is what he set his heart to know. And this is what man, and when he says the burdensome task God has given, that is to say that this is what man has always tried to figure out. Man has always sought the answers to why things happen the way they do, what is the meaning of life, and all this. This is what, quote-unquote, burdensome task God, which is to say that there's a reason why we're not given all the answers up front from the perspective of human. Again, keep in mind, Ecclesiastes is being written from the perspective of a human being, not from a spiritual mind so much as it is from a human being perspective. And trying to figure out the meaning of life under heaven, that's a tall order. That's a tall task. Verse 14, I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and indeed all is vanity and grasping for the wind. There's a lot of allegory, there's a lot of imagery that Solomon uses to describe the realities of life. And he uses the phrase grasping for the wind. This is one of those phrases that sometimes we hear every now and then. People use it from time to time. What does that mean? Grasping for the wind. When there's a breeze coming, we had like up to 60-mile-an-hour gusts a couple days ago. Okay, the wind was blowing really hard. Can you grab it? Can you grab hold of it and actually hold the wind? No, you can't. You can't hold on to air anyway. But it's vain. It's like it's useless. It's pointless. Why even try to grab hold of the wind when there's not going to be any result, any outcome that's going to happen? So when he says, I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, everything that man is involved in, this goes back to concerning all that is done under heaven of verse 13. Solomon's seeking to know and understand not just all that happens, but the nature of it, and for that matter, the vanity of it. And what should man then set his mind towards? If everything is vanity and everything is grasping for the wind, it's useless, then really what should man be focused on? What should he pay attention to? And so that's why he describes verse 13 and 14. I've seen all the works, and Solomon of all people was in a position to see all the works of man and to realize that all is vanity and grasping for the wind. Anything through verse 14. Verse 15, what is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be numbered. I communed with my heart, saying, look, I have attained greatness and have gained more wisdom than all who were before me in Jerusalem. My heart has understood great wisdom and knowledge. So between verse 14 and verse 16, you would think the thought just kind of flows. What is verse 15 doing in there? What is crooked cannot be made straight. What is lacking cannot be numbered. Focus on the adjectives here, crooked and lacking. What do those represent? Something that is crooked or something that is lacking? Sorry? It's bad stuff, right? These are negative types of things. If something is crooked, well, crooked is very rarely a good thing. It's always generally a bad thing. If something is lacking, it means it doesn't have enough of. Not complete. Okay? And crooked is not straight. And it's this concept of not having proper sense or proper purpose, I guess you could say. So when he says there in verse 15, what is crooked cannot be, well, who can make it straight, first of all? Who can make anything straight? God can. Okay, and there's even references in the New Testament about making straight the paths of the feeble and so forth. Who can make up for any lack? God can. But again, from what perspective is Solomon observing these things? From man. Okay, man, there are certain things man just has no control over, and one of those things is that in this life, all is vanity and grasping for the wind. It is in that context that Solomon says, what is crooked cannot be made straight. Is there anything we can do to change that? No. Man, the nature of man is always going to be the same. We can't fix that. We can't change that. What is lacking in man can't be made up for. It can't be numbered. There's a whole host of things that are vanity in this life, and that's no matter how much we may observe it, how much we may realize it and understand it, it's not going to change it. Which leads to verse 16, I communed with my heart, saying, look, I have attained greatness. Yes, he did. And of course, God blessed him because he had asked for wisdom. God blessed him also with greatness and wealth and power and fame. I have gained more wisdom than all who were before me in Jerusalem. That's absolutely true. And of course, but to a certain extent, the wisdom that God gave Solomon accompanies with it. It's not just like he was given all knowledge of everything. Okay, a lot of times I think that gets a little confusing when we think about wisdom. Wisdom in many ways is there's an element of wisdom that is very instinctive. Okay, you can have a whole lot of knowledge, all you want, but if you're not really using that in a practical way, you're not very wise with that knowledge. Wisdom carries with it a sense of instinctive practicality. So what Solomon did was he took this innate wisdom that God had blessed him with and then sought to understand everything that he observed. In other words, he didn't have the knowledge. Okay? He lacked the knowledge. He had the wisdom. Okay? We talk about knowledge without wisdom. Well, he had the wisdom without necessarily having all of the knowledge. So he sought out to know all of this stuff, to be able to filter it through this great wisdom God had given him to understand the nature of man. So when he says in verse 17, I set my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly, I perceive that this also is grasping for the wind. When he says, I set my heart to know wisdom, that's not to say that he didn't have wisdom. He did. But to know wisdom means to understand the nature of wisdom, and to that end, specifically in the context in which he's using it, the nature of man. And he said he sought to know madness and folly. Does that mean he was wanting to go insane? What does Solomon mean when he says, I wanted to know madness and folly? First of all, what's folly? Foolishness, silliness, uselessness to a certain extent. That which is not profitable. Okay, it's similar to vanity, but it has a little bit more of a harmless connotation, where vanity has usually a negative connotation. Madness. What do you think Solomon could mean when he says madness?
In contrast to wisdom that he said he was searching for, so the lack of this chaos.
Ignorance, doing things without really knowing what you're doing. Or the opposite of understanding why people do things without knowing or making sense of things.
It's like continuing to do something over and over again, expecting
to.
results, but it never happens.
Didn't Einstein define that as being the definition of insanity? Okay, he's trying to learn the nature of man in all of his states. Okay, to understand how man processes these events, the observation of man kind of as a whole, mankind as a whole, in all of his different situations and circumstances, with wisdom, with folly, with madness. Again, in the context of this, the lack of wisdom, the lack of knowledge, kind of the blind leading the blind type of thing. He's seeking to understand all of this and to be able to filter it through this great wisdom God had given him. And he says this is also grasping for the wind. So what does he mean when he says, I set my heart to know these things, but I perceive that this is also grasping for the wind? Is it possible for any one person to be able to understand the nature of mankind in all of its facets? No. From a human perspective, absolutely not. Solomon sought it out. Doesn't mean he actually did it. And if Solomon, with all of his wisdom, couldn't achieve it, then I don't know who could. Again, from a human perspective, he sought to understand these things. Now, his observations led him to conclusions. But in terms of actually knowing wisdom and knowing madness and knowing folly and all of the circumstances that man deals with and how he reacts to them, this is grasping for the wind. Anything through verse 17 so far? Yes, ma'am.
If you think about the outward demeanor of wise people and the outward demeanor of people who are silly and foolish, they're very different.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the mental picture I get is very different.
Yeah.
And so, if you think about that, then to it's striking to me that we gain knowledge before we gain wisdom, and he did it kind of
The other way around.
So he could make really wise choices where we make a lot of foolish choices till we gain wisdom. Right?
Yeah.
So he's out there trying to figure out the knowledge part of it and the foolish part of it, and we kind of do it all at once.
Yeah. And often by making mistakes and learning from them, too.
We have the wisest man ever saying that it doesn't matter what you pursue, it's all foolishness.
Yeah.
It's all grasping for the wind.
Again, from the human, mortal perspective.
Right.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And to understand the motivations that people have sometimes. You know, there are times where, again, this is coming from a Christian, a spiritual perspective. But sometimes there's some sitcoms and stuff that I've seen episodes of, and these people are engaged in all kinds of craziness. Getting drunk, forgetting whole days and hours at a time, ending up in somebody else's bed, not knowing why they're there or what happened, and they think it was awesome. And I'm like, why would anybody think that was awesome? I don't understand. I don't get it. And trying to understand the motivations of people, if that's all they have in their life, that's the biggest thing that they have, the biggest thrill, it's a state of sadness, to me, from my perspective. And so, to a certain extent, I think there are times we can relate to what Solomon's saying, because I'm sure there are times where we've observed somebody do something really dumb, and you're just like, why? Why? Why would you do that? What could possibly be the motivation or the thought process in doing that? And then you realize, oh wait, there probably wasn't a thought process in doing that. And this is part of what Solomon was observing, but with Solomon, it wasn't just a one-time instance or a scenario or example. It's all of mankind he's seeking to figure out. Verse 18, for in much wisdom is much grief, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. Keep in mind, wisdom and knowledge are not the same thing. They are related. You can't really use the one without the other. Wisdom in and of itself is useless without the means to apply it. Knowledge in and of itself is useless without the wisdom in order to know where it goes and how it works and so forth. But what Solomon describes is, with much wisdom, there's much grief. And I think from a spiritual perspective, and again, he's writing this, there are going to be times where he kind of steps out of himself for a moment. Okay, he's in this vein of mortal thinking, this human, physical way of thinking. Then he kind of steps out of himself for a moment to make an observation about that state. And this is one of those moments of verse 18. With much wisdom is much grief. What he's realizing is that the more wisdom and the more knowledge you gain, the more you realize what? About life. The more you don't understand, and especially when it comes to these infinite variables of man and their motivations, but also what's the one conclusion you do understand?
Well, this stuff is vanity.
It's all useless. It's all vanity. It's all grasping for the wind. And the more he observed and the more he gained knowledge of his surroundings and observed man and his choices and his decisions, and the more he didn't understand it, the more he couldn't figure it out, the more he realized none of this matters from a physical, mortal perspective. Anything else through chapter 1? Yes, sir.
I'm not sure exactly how we could say he had or used wisdom with that knowledge. I mean, in the verse 16 he says, I had great both wisdom and great knowledge.
Yeah.
So he's in this pursuit of how does knowledge work, or wisdom, what it's all about.
Sure.
But he did have knowledge.
Sure. I think it's not that he didn't have knowledge, it's that he had far more wisdom than he had knowledge. You know, generally it works the other way around for us. When we grow, we kind of tend to outgrow our wisdom, and we have the knowledge, but especially in our teenage years, we tend to have the knowledge, but a severe lack of wisdom. But then there are those who are wise beyond their years, we use that phrase sometimes, whose wisdom seems to outpace their age, more so than is normal. And I think that's what we're observing with Solomon, is that Solomon's wisdom, because of God's gift to him, God didn't gift him knowledge. The knowledge he did have, certainly from his upbringing, from the time he had spent as king up to that point, but the wisdom God gave him didn't incorporate knowledge. That he sought, because of his wisdom, he sought to gain knowledge, which is why he says in verse 16, notice he says, I've attained greatness, I've gained more wisdom. It didn't end with what God gave him. There was an accumulation even after that. My heart has understood. Now he's speaking as Solomon the aged. My heart has understood great wisdom and knowledge. Yeah, at this point, he absolutely has great wisdom and knowledge. But what I'm suggesting is that has been a process. And that's what leads to verse 18. With much wisdom is much grief. And with the increase of knowledge, increase of sorrow. How did he know that? Because he learned it. That's what he gained as he perceived, as he sought at knowledge and filtered it through this wisdom, which also he gained more and more of as he went along. He observed all this. Anything else to chapter 1, I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am.
The English Standard uses the word vexation for grief, and then the italicized is an addition, correct?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So for in much wisdom, much
Vexation.
So
Yeah.
I'm just saying, if you read it, for in much wisdom, much grief, much vexation, right? Because when we are wise and we watch kids even,
Yeah.
we can see their mistakes coming.
Yeah.
You know, we can tell young people, don't marry that person.
Yeah.
You know, you can tell them, don't date that person. We can tell them, be careful who you hang out with. We all know that because we've already lived it, you know.
You know, there's a certain amount of despair as a parent, I'm sure, when you see your kids maybe making mistakes that you had made in the past, that you warned them about, but they still did. But I have heard from a handful of elderly folks who are grandparents and great-grandparents that sometimes, you know, generally people think it's better once you get to the grandparent stage because you're not the parent. But in some cases, they've said it's worse because now they're seeing a whole new generation come and they see their children making the same mistakes with their children that the grandparent made with them. And so it's like just a continual kind of passing the buck of proneness to make mistakes and proneness of lack of wisdom and so forth. And that's the kind of the sad part, is that the older you get, the more you see, yeah, you know, society changes, but man doesn't change. Nothing new under the sun. Nothing new under the sun. And this is part of the reason why Solomon's writing this. He's not writing this to say, hey, don't make the same mistakes I made. That's not so much. That certainly there is an application of that from a physical perspective, because certainly Solomon's going to deal with that. But the broader aspect to this is, in order to avoid it, understand your nature, understand the proper perspective and priorities you should have in this world, which is fear God and keep His commandments. That's all that matters. Nothing else matters. Fear God and keep His commandments. And if you do that, you won't make the same mistakes that Solomon made, of course. But ultimately, that is the conclusion that Solomon comes to. Yes, ma'am.
Well, and what a valuable lesson for us, because we have the wisest man, a man blessed by God, that intentionally set about understanding human beings. And he's saying all that we do is vanity and foolishness, except this one thing.
Right.
You know, I could say that, and it wouldn't have near the impact, because I didn't focus my life on what he did.
Yeah.
You know, I didn't go out and party. I mean, you know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? So he allowed himself to do everything,
Right.
right? And processed it and tried to, you know, whatever it was. And he's like, nothing is worth, the only thing of value is to keep God's commandments.
You know, that's really interesting that you say that, Lisa, because I had never thought about it. Have you ever had a conversation with somebody who was very worldly, maybe in their activities and in their mindset, and maybe they've said something along the lines to you, well, you need to walk a day in my shoes, or you don't know what it's like to be me. You know, you are goody two-shoes, you've never been in the world like this and so forth, so you don't know what this is like. Okay? And for many of us, that might be true. But Solomon, did he experience everything there was to experience?
Yes.
Absolutely. So can anyone say to Solomon, well, Solomon, you don't know what it's like? Can they say that about Solomon? No. So I had never really thought about that from that perspective, that's one of the excuses or defenses that people give. Well, you don't know what it's like to be me, or what I grew up with, or what I had to deal with that led me to this state. You don't know what it's like to be me. Well, you know what? Solomon's been there, done that. He's done all of it. And here's what he concluded. Anything else through chapter 1? Chapter 2. I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with mirth. Therefore enjoy pleasure. But surely this also was vanity. I said of laughter, madness, and of mirth, what does it accomplish? I searched in my heart how to gratify my flesh with wine, while guiding my heart with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the sons of men to do under heaven all the days of their lives. So here's where he starts to get into the practical. And again, this is from a worldly human perspective, but the practical ways in which he tested to see what the outcome would be, the observations that he would make. And obviously, he tested on himself. Okay, there was some, I guess you could say, experimentation he did to see what the outcomes of these things would be. That doesn't make them right. Okay? And again, keep in mind that at a certain point in Solomon's life, he was led astray by the false gods of his wives, and he gave himself over to things like this. But what he says here is, he said, I said in my heart. So he's speaking to himself. I will test myself, is what he's saying. I will test myself with mirth. Therefore enjoy pleasure. But surely this also was vanity. So he's seeking to experience mirth. Okay, the bubbling up of excitement, the bubbling up of, I say, joy from a human emotional perspective, of happiness. Okay, so he sought to enjoy pleasure because that's what produces mirth. Things that are pleasurable make us happy. So when he says in verse 2, I said of laughter, madness. Things that are silly, things that are, again, that's not necessarily a negative connotation. We involve in things that are silly sometimes. We say jokes and we laugh and we chuckle, and that's fine. There's a time and place for that. But he gave himself over to understanding this. So he said of laughter, madness, and of mirth, what does it accomplish? So of laughter, things that are silly, things that are folly, even though they have their time and place and they're not negative or evil of themselves, he says madness. Because it doesn't change anything, doesn't do anything, and it doesn't accomplish anything. And of mirth, of this enjoying of pleasure, what does it accomplish? So he's already observed that both mirth or folly and madness are vanity. So he says in verse 3, I searched in my heart how to gratify my flesh with wine. When he says how to gratify his flesh with wine, he's speaking to in the Old Testament, it was often referred to as tarrying long at wine or strong drink. There are particular phrases that carry with it the intent of becoming inebriated. And this is what he's describing here. It's not just having something to drink. Remember, keep in mind, in the Old and the New Testaments for that matter, typical water was mixed with wine as a means of juice. They didn't have refrigeration, but of juice in order to help purify the water. But having the wine straight, okay, allowing it to ferment, allowing it to become wine and drinking it straight, that was considered strong drink. And so when we consider what he says here, I search in my heart how to gratify my flesh with wine while guiding my heart with wisdom. This was one of the means by which he experienced the pleasure or mirth which came from it, and laughter or madness which came from it, the folly. So the wine kind of helped him, and again, we know what alcohol does to the human system. a single glass of wine, a single can of beer, whatever, science has shown that it brings your blood alcohol level to a point where your inhibitions lower. And immediately there is a lessening of restriction. You don't feel as inhibited to do things that maybe you know you ordinarily wouldn't do or shouldn't do. And so that's what Solomon used that for, was a means to experiment and to consider this. That's why he says, while guiding my heart with wisdom, to know it, to understand what this was all about, how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the sons of men to do under heaven all the days of their lives. Is it good for man to devote himself to folly and to madness? Is it good for man to devote himself to mirth? What is it good for man to devote himself to do? Have you ever known of anyone who devoted themselves to, say, alcohol, that made them happy, and so that's what they gave themselves to? Okay. Do you think Solomon, when he says to see what was good for the sons of man, since we're mortal, since this is all vanity anyway, what's good for the sons of man to do while he's on the earth? What should he give himself over to seeking to enjoy, to experience? Any thoughts or comments through verse 3?
I just think an important thing to remember is while guiding my heart with wisdom. He didn't throw everything to the wind.
Yeah.
He didn't do risky behaviors. He had a little bit of something in there, to guide himself by.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say he became so inebriated that he was completely thoughtless in that sense. I wouldn't necessarily go or stop short of saying that he didn't sin either, from the perspective that you can still have a mind that is seeking to understand something, but if you're doing something sinful in order to understand it, does that make it okay? No. Okay, so there is, to a certain extent, when I picture what he's going through right now, this is kind of, at least at the beginning, if not in the middle of this spiral away from God. I don't think right now he's currently in the mindset of when he's enjoying this pleasure, and it may have prompted his spiral away from God, but in pursuing these things, he's going to acknowledge that what he did wasn't right. Okay, he himself is going to acknowledge that. So whether this prompted his spiral from turning away from serving God, or this was happening in the midst of it, regardless, there is a connection between the two. So, absolutely, there is that filter of wisdom, but does wisdom of itself keep us from sinning? It didn't for Solomon, we know that. Okay, so it makes me wonder if Solomon maybe had a little bit too much confidence in that wisdom. That if this was what prompted his spiral away from God, if perhaps he had a little bit of overconfidence because of this great wisdom that he received from God, and maybe he thought himself immune to the effects of what he was experiencing. Something to think about. Anything else through verse 3?
There might be a little bit of opposition in both of the phrases. On both ends of verse 3, he's asking how. I'm seeking out how to gratify my flesh with wine while guarding my heart with wisdom.
Yeah. Yeah.
About wine, and not only does it get rid of the inhibitions, your brain cells start to die.
Yeah.
So you're not going to be having the wise thoughts.
That's true.
At that point.
That's true.
So how can I drink and still be wise?
How can I have both?
How can I be so foolish that I understand what's good for men to do all the days of their life?
Yeah.
How can I do that? To me, that's what he's kind of wrestling with.
Yeah.
These are opposite ends of the spectrum kind of things. If I'm doing one, it's not leading to the other.
Right.
But as a whole, the whole verse goes against the principles of sobriety and self-control in the New Testament. Obviously.
Certainly. Yeah. Anything else through verse 3? Verse 4. I made my works great. I built myself houses and planted myself vineyards. I made myself gardens and orchards. I planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made myself water pools from which to water the growing trees of the grove. I acquired male and female servants and had servants born in my house. Yes, I had greater possessions of herds and flocks than all who were in Jerusalem before me. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the special treasures of kings and of the provinces. I acquired male and female singers, the delights of the sons of men, and musical instruments of all kinds. He talks about all the things that he acquired, and of course that acquiring led to the experiencing of them too. Okay, the eating of these fruits, the enjoying of these singers and these instruments. Okay, keep in mind, they didn't have the technology we have, so some of the things that Solomon kind of took entertainment in, we might think, that's kind of lame, but this is what they had. And especially Solomon in all his wealth and all of his power, he was able to indulge. And I guess that's probably one of the key thoughts in the book of Ecclesiastes is the indulgences of pleasure that Solomon was able to experience, from which he realized none of this matters. Verse 9, so I became great and excelled more than all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure. For my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my reward from all my labor. Then I looked on all the works that my hands had done, and on the labor in which I had toiled. And indeed all was vanity and grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun. All right, we'll stop there, but he's observing everything that he gained and all the pleasure that came from it, and certainly nothing necessarily sinful in of itself in that area of experience that he had, but what he realized was none of it matters. All right, we'll pick up with verse 9 next Wednesday night. Thank you, everybody, for the thoughts and comments.